I think it's just 1 o'clock now, so we can get started here. Jill obviously was chatting to us earlier here. Jill is product manager on our team, senior product manager for the ArcGIS Enterprise team. I'm Maggie Busick, a product manager on the ArcGIS Enterprise team. And today we are going to be walking you through the ArcGIS Enterprise and Introduction for Developers session. Just a quick reminder here, the information that we're sharing in this presentation is confidential and not intended to be redistributed. Please take notes for yourself. You're even welcome to take photos for yourself, but please just don't be posting them anywhere or things like that. But please take advantage of this content, of course. Today's agenda, we're going to be walking through a few things here. We're going to get started with what ArcGIS Enterprise really is. It sounds like many of you in the audience are already using the product today. But this will be a refresher on the 3 different perspectives that we really think about ArcGIS Enterprise from the perspective of an end user, an administrator, and then, of course, developers. We'll be talking through the REST APIs. Jill will take us through that section. And also the Enterprise SDK is an ability to kind of extend ArcGIS Enterprise to better meet your needs. We'll talk through SOEs, SOIs, we'll talk through webhooks, and a relatively recent addition to Enterprise custom data feeds. And then we'll close this session with client SDKs and APIs. We saw a lot of exciting demos earlier today in the plenary going through some of this technology, so we'll talk about your options there with Enterprise. All right, so what actually is Enterprise? Again, it seems like lots of you are already familiar, but we want to kind of take you through these 3 key user groups that we think about with Enterprise. So at the highest level, we have this definition of Enterprise. It's that foundational system for mapping and visualization, data management, spatial analysis, application building. It's really that backbone for all of your GIS workflows, and often you're needing to work across the entire ArcGIS system as a whole, integrating with ArcGIS Pro, ArcGIS Online, and then the full suite of applications that are powered by Enterprise. Enterprise is a self-hosted software. You're installing it on your own infrastructure that you're in charge of and control. That can be in the cloud, it could be on premises, and it's going to be scalable to meet the needs of you and your organization. But digging into this definition a little bit further, it's really talking to those 3 key audiences that we're thinking about. First up, we have our end users. They're the folks that are doing that mapping and visualization, data management, spatial analysis, building applications, doing all of that really critical GIS work. And they're often working across that ArcGIS system, like we said, with those different parts of our product suite. Enterprise, being a self-hosted software, has a very strong IT component to it, and so our IT administrators are represented here in that latter half of the definition. Our IT administrators here in the audience or at your organization are responsible for actually installing the software, deciding where it needs to be installed, and making sure you're scaling and tuning it to meet the needs of your organization. And then finally, the bulk of our presentation today is going to, of course, focus on developers, given that we're at Dev Summit here today. And you all as developers really live across the entire definition and stack of Enterprise. You might be doing things like building custom applications that take advantage of mapping and visualization and data that's coming from ArcGIS Enterprise. Maybe you're extending the functionality of ArcGIS Enterprise to meet your specific business needs. Or maybe you're helping out folks in the IT department, automating some of that administration associated with the product, really playing a key role across this entire definition of Enterprise. So let's dig into these personas a little bit further. Again, ArcGIS Enterprise for end users end users are a huge group of our users of Enterprise, and they often really think of Enterprise as this front-end user experience. So they're really typically interacting with the Enterprise portal, which we see here on the screen. That's where you're doing mapping, interacting with your content, working with users and groups and things like that. Looks like we have a little animation problem here, but again, you might be doing mapping within the map viewer here. Maybe you're working with your content, as we can see in the Enterprise portal. Maybe you're doing analysis within the map viewer, taking advantage of those analysis tools there. Lots can be happening in that front-end experience. And we often have our end users kind of get confused maybe between enterprise and online, and that's because they look very similar on the front end. On the left side of the screen here, we have that ArcGIS Enterprise portal, and then we have an ArcGIS Online organization on the right-hand side. And you can tell they look pretty much identical. That's intentional. We actually share a code base. There are some nuances between the two products on the front end, but largely that user experience is going to be very similar. Now, where things start to get really different is on the back end of ArcGIS Enterprise. And again, that's because Enterprise is this self-hosted software, by contrast to ArcGIS Online, which is a software as a service product, meaning we as Esri are hosting and maintaining that product for you. So with Enterprise being the software you control, you're going to have to think through a lot of considerations and questions as an IT administrator. First up, which deployment option do you want to use for Enterprise? We have 3 of them. You can either deploy on Windows, Linux, or on Kubernetes. What's the best fit for you? Enterprise is installed on your own infrastructure. Where does that live? Do you want to have Enterprise installed on premises, on physical servers there? Is it going to be on virtual machines? Is it going to be private cloud, public cloud? It's all up to you for what makes most sense. You can also choose, do you want to install Enterprise inside of your firewall or outside of your firewall? What meets the needs of your organization? You might also be really concerned with security and need to be totally disconnected from the open internet and have a disconnected environment. That's an option with Enterprise. Or maybe you do want to be connected, and you can make that choice as well when you're architecting and configuring your system. You'll also need to start to think about the needs of your users from the perspective of availability. What are the kind of uptime requirements that you have associated with your deployment and system? And then how are you going to need to scale out your deployment to meet those needs? Is it okay if you install Enterprise completely on a single machine? That works for a lot of organizations. But other organizations might want to scale it out across multiple machines to better meet the needs of their organization, maybe 4 machines, maybe even more than that. These are all things you're thinking through as an IT administrator with Enterprise. So as an IT administrator of Enterprise, you are thinking about a lot more than just that front-end user experience that we were looking at from the end user perspective. You're actually thinking about what that back end of the software looks like, and in the case of the Windows and Linux deployment options, you are thinking about the different software components that actually make up Enterprise. If you'll remember from the last slide, we have 3 different deployment options: Windows, Linux, and Kubernetes. The next few slides here are really applicable to our Windows and Linux deployment options. Under the hood, ArcGIS Enterprise on Kubernetes looks quite different. And so again, the next few slides here are just going to cover our Windows and Linux deployment option. So Enterprise on Windows and Linux is actually made up of a variety of software components. And the great thing about Enterprise is you can scale it and customize it to meet the needs of your users. But just to have that working foundation of Enterprise, you'll need what's called the ArcGIS Enterprise base deployment. And on Windows and Linux, it's made up of these 4 software components. We have our ArcGIS data store, the ArcGIS server, portal for ArcGIS, and then 2 ArcGIS web adapters. Now, I think it's helpful to look at Enterprise from all of these different perspectives, those 3 key groups that we think about. Even if you fall into one category, sometimes we see folks that are falling into multiple categories. It's helpful to see that perspective of different types of users of Enterprise. So as you interact with other folks at your organization that might be using Enterprise from a different perspective, you can collaborate more effectively. So maybe you're an IT administrator, you're not necessarily working in the front end of Enterprise, but it's helpful to know what types of work front-end users might be doing and what part of the actual product they're interacting with. So as you're trying to troubleshoot things or maybe tune your deployment, you can have more constructive and collaborative conversations around that. And then, of course, the inverse is true too. If you're an end user or a developer, kind of understanding this back-end piece of Enterprise is helpful to collaborate with folks in the IT department. So we can see here on this slide those different types of users that are interacting with these different components of the product. So let's take a look at what these components actually do, of course. First up, we have our portal for ArcGIS component, and this is the software component that actually powers your Enterprise portal on the back end. So again, that front-end experience we were looking at, it's where you are working with your content that you might have shared from your desktop GIS, you are creating maps, you're doing analysis, you're working with applications, all of that stuff is happening within your enterprise portal, and that's powered by your Portal for ArcGIS component. This is where, again, enterprise is really similar to ArcGIS Online. Now, moving along to our ArcGIS Server component, this we often think of as kind of the powerhouse of ArcGIS Enterprise, and that's because it's responsible for powering all of our GIS services that are what power our different items within the enterprise portal on the back end. So any sorts of requests that we have coming into those items from the enterprise portal, things like zooming around on a map, you're trying to find a location, you're running some analysis tools, all of that is sending requests into the ArcGIS server. The ArcGIS server is going to scale based on the traffic that's coming into it, and then in conjunction with our ArcGIS data store, it creates what's called our hosting server. So with Enterprise, you are able to work with data coming from two places, really. So you can either work with user-managed data. Those are your own data sources, whether it's enterprise geo database, a cloud data warehouse, whatever it might be. You can make a direct connection to that user-managed data. You can also work with ArcGIS managed data, so that means you're actually sharing it to ArcGIS Enterprise and it's hosted by ArcGIS Enterprise as a system. And that copy of the data you're sharing to be stored and hosted within Enterprise has to live somewhere, of course, and that's going to live in our ArcGIS data store here. The ArcGIS data store also plays the role of things like if you're working with the map viewer and you're running analysis tools, the results of those analysis tools often need to be stored somewhere, of course. And so things like if you're running a buffer within the map viewer, the results of that buffer could get stored in the ArcGIS data store. Now, that was our base deployment we were looking at, but ArcGIS Enterprise can get a lot more complicated and give you a lot more capabilities depending on what the needs of your organization are. And one really common way we start to see people build out their deployment with additional capabilities is through the use of server roles. So these server roles really allow you to do specialized types of work. So maybe you're working with knowledge graphs, maybe you're doing different types of imagery processing, you're using real-time data, all sorts of things, or maybe you're using video server, which we heard about today. All of these are ways to add that kind of specialized set of capabilities that you might need at your organization. I know we do have a session on this later on in the conference about extending beyond the base deployment, so if you think you might be interested in these or learning more, we have that session, and then we also, of course, can talk to you at the showcase about it. We're in an intro session today, so I'm not going to dive into any of these specifically, but the beauty of Enterprise is you can continue to build it out to meet your needs. And then finally, of course, ArcGIS Enterprise has a very strong developer story, and that's actually what we're going to be focusing on for the rest of the session here. We have lots of tools available to you to build custom applications, to extend ArcGIS Enterprise. We have REST APIs that allow you to interact with those different components of the product that we've been talking about. And so why don't we dive right in with REST APIs first with you, Jill.
Great. Thank you, Maggie. So Maggie gave us a really good foundation for ArcGIS Enterprise here, and then this is going to be able to give us a bit of being able to build upon it with this developer story, give you some examples of how, as a developer, you can interact with ArcGIS Enterprise. The first of which is going to be the REST APIs. So those are really the fundamental underpinnings for how ArcGIS Enterprise works. Everything that's happening with this web request of ArcGIS Enterprise, there are REST requests there, and there's REST APIs that are powering the systems and the user interfaces you interact with. So before we get into Enterprise directly, let's talk about some conceptual components, though. You can think about how there's infrastructure. That's the turquoise rectangle on the bottom there. So that's where you actually have the machines and the data stored. That's where you see the software that Maggie was telling us about. There's functionality that this infrastructure can help implement. There's GIS servers there that are powering the data. There's an information model built upon that. That's where your organization is. So that's where the content management system is. So you can see as you move up this stack, you have your data. It could be in SQL Server. It could be published to ArcGIS Server. It could be then an item in your ArcGIS Enterprise organization. And then lastly, there's the user experience. So that's where users are interacting with ArcGIS Enterprise. That's where your end users are. That could be through the web maps, the web apps, scenes, anything else like that. And you can see how this aligns with two of those components that Maggie was telling us about. So ArcGIS Server is really the powerhouse that is powering the services and doing the analysis and doing the actual processing of these requests coming in. And the interactions on ArcGIS Enterprise are happening directly in the enterprise portal there. We can break this down and look at actually what REST APIs are associated with each part of this structure here. So in the infrastructure, on the server side, you're going to be able to find a REST API specific to administrating ArcGIS Enterprise. There's one for ArcGIS Server and one for the enterprise portal. There you can see that they're at /portaladmin or /admin. Those are URLs you would navigate to. I have a QR code for you guys later so that you can have some context for this and you don't need to just figure it out in a web browser. The reason why I mention this, though, is that if you were to be working in some of the interfaces of the user interface in ArcGIS Enterprise Server Manager, or if you're in the ArcGIS Enterprise portal, if you were to capture the web traffic, you'll see requests going to these REST APIs here. So really, that enterprise portal, that server manager, is a wrapper for these REST APIs. There's also a separate one for services, which is /REST/services that's found on ArcGIS Server. There's also one for you working with users, groups, and items. You'll hear that called the sharing API, and that is specific to the enterprise portal. So let's break it down a little bit into what each of these APIs actually provides. So that sharing API, that's where you are being able to interact with the users, groups, and items. So when you think about ArcGIS Enterprise being a content management system, you'll be able to see that there are certain calls to specific IDs for the item in the organization. You'll be able to hear about the users and groups being the foundation of the security model. Everything in ArcGIS Enterprise is associated with a named user. Content is either owned by that user or shared with other users through groups. And all of this is really implemented through the sharing API. Even when you add an item to a group in the enterprise portal, if you look at the web traffic, it's all happening at the sharing API level. The items are how services are actually exposed and being able to be shared out through the organization, whether that's through groups or distributed collaboration. That's all happening here at this level. And this API is actually very similar to what we have in ArcGIS Online as well. So when Maggie said that that front-end interface is very similar to ArcGIS Online, guess what? It's not just the interface, it's also the underlying REST APIs there as well. Moving on down into the area where the functionality is, there is a REST Services API. This is where geospatial functionality is exposed as REST-based web services. So that could be for map services, that could be when you're just drawing your vector data, querying your data, trying to see what that data is actually showing you with those attributes. There's feature services. That's also when you could be editing as well, whether that's creates, reads, updates, deletes of that data. Geocoding of address locators, network services being able to route on a street network, geoprocessing services. So this can be for analysis jobs based on Python or Model Builder. These are just 5 examples of services that you can have in ArcGIS Server, ArcGIS Enterprise, and there are way more than this. But regardless of what service you're using, there are REST requests to those services that are making the actual work happen. When you open a web map and you pan and zoom, and you just have a base map, if you look at the traffic for that map service, that's the base map there, there's actually an export request for every single pan and zoom that goes from the client to ArcGIS Server. And ArcGIS Server will take that request and return an image, whether it's a JPEG or a PNG, as part of that export request. So whether you're using Map Viewer or you decide that you want to do it on your own as a developer for a custom application, this just helps illustrate how these APIs are really critical for just understanding to help make the behavior happen on your own. For example here, this is the export operation. When I'm talking about this, you'll see actually on the bottom of the screenshot, there are different operations there. You'll see the ability to export the map, query the map, identify. There's a lot that you can do here at the REST endpoint. And map services have a consistent set of operations that are exposed. Same for feature services. Feature services are editable. You're going to be able to apply edits. You won't be able to apply edits necessarily to an image service. So they're very specific for the service type, and our documentation goes through a whole examples for every single one of the map services and what's exposed at the REST API there. Lastly, there is also that admin API I had mentioned. So ArcGIS Enterprise has different APIs for the portal for ArcGIS component and the ArcGIS server component. You'll be able to see this when you maybe are taking care of security in your organization. Maybe you're setting up a DNS for your organization. All of this is going to be happening in the admin API. It's also where you'll access your logs and be able to monitor your organization's health and status and see what kind of requests are coming into your organization. One thing I want to note, though, is that Portal for ArcGIS and ArcGIS Server are only found in Enterprise on Windows and Linux. ArcGIS Enterprise on Kubernetes has an entirely different REST API called the Enterprise Manager API. So that's there for you there too. Has its own set of documentation. There's a lot of parallels between them. So you don't need to be the expert, but just know that, be aware of that the APIs are going to vary a little bit there for you. Now, I don't think most of you are going to be necessarily interacting with the REST API day in and day out, but we're trying to give you this context for the next set of ways that you can interact with ArcGIS Enterprise as a developer. And that is through our ArcGIS Enterprise SDK. That's something that we heard about this morning in the plenary with David, and it's a way of being able to make the backend of ArcGIS Enterprise do things a little bit differently. Maybe Enterprise does what you need to do out of the box, maybe 95% of the way there. With some custom code, you can make it 100%, hopefully. If not, we can have conversations later. But to really meet all of the needs of what you need this software to do for you and your company. So the ArcGIS Enterprise SDK allows for developers to extend the functionality of map and image services shared through ArcGIS Pro. This comes in the flavor of two extensions, which are our server object extensions and our server object interceptors. So these can be written in .NET or Java, depending on which environment you're in. On Windows, you're going to be a little bit more limited with Java and Linux. And they're going to be enabled through ArcGIS Server Manager. Because they're enabled through ArcGIS Server Manager, they're only available on Windows and Linux. Kubernetes functionality is a little bit limited on the SOEs front, and SOIs are not there yet. So this is going to be a Windows Linux story. And while the Enterprise SDK is very similar to the ArcObjects SDK, which was written for ArcMap-based services, for services published from ArcMap, the Enterprise SDK has its own distinct API. That's why it's for services that are only shared from ArcGIS Pro, not the services that were published from ArcMap and that are still using that ArcMap-based runtime there. We often talk about SOEs and SOIs being really similar, but they are two different things. So when we're talking about server object extensions, this is in creating the ability to add business logic that can power entirely custom solutions through new APIs. Now, these operations are exposed to the ArcGIS Server REST API that I just told you about, and they are custom operations. Maybe you have your query, you have your export, but you want something that's called field calculation. It's a new REST operation that you add at that REST endpoint for the map services or image services there. And because it's something custom, Map Viewer won't know what to do with that. Experience Builder won't know what to do with that. And that's why a custom application is critical to be able to access the functionality of this SOE. That being said, it does not integrate with all Esri apps because you can do so much with it. How can Esri read your mind and know exactly what you're creating here? So I have an example of this to provide some context for that just definition and perhaps word goop I gave you. So you can think about being election night. State officials may want to have their users click on any county in a mapping app and return the vote percentages for each candidate. It sounds great, but we only have the raw number of votes. So that's there with a standard query through the REST API on the left side of the screen. The map service only has those raw numbers. Now, field calculations can be performed by the client, but that's going to put all the load on the client, and also you will not have that consistent experience of getting the percentage of votes through the client if the client doesn't know to look for it, and it's not going to be doing server-side rendering. With a custom query of an SOE, you can have field calculations show up. You have this percentage shown there in real time. So as soon as the raw number of candidates is changed, you'll have the percentage changed as well. So that map service will only have the data, but yet that SOE, that server object extension that's extending the map service, will then be able to query the data and calculate the percentages before returning results to the client. So this is going to have a consistent result from the server, not putting that pressure on the client, doing server-side processing, letting server do the lifting there as well. And that way, if you have a client that can read this custom operation, this SOE provides a lot of consistency there as well. Now, server object interceptors. These are the SOIs. These add business logic as well that expands existing standard Esri REST APIs through pre or post processing of requests. So it's not adding a different operation at the REST endpoint, it's doing some processing in between. So the client will send that request to ArcGIS server. ArcGIS server will intercept it, they're appropriately named, and then that response will be manipulated before being sent back to the client. So that means that this custom business logic is accessible throughout the ArcGIS system. That means it can be with a custom client. Maybe you make your own web applications using some of those open source software we heard about today. Maybe you are doing something like Map Viewer. Maybe you're doing an experience builder application. They really integrate well with Esri apps because it's not changing at the REST level, it's happening on the server level when that request is intercepted. An example of this is something that we see quite often is custom watermarks. You can think about a utility service wanting to have a custom watermark anytime that an image is printed. So whenever an export request takes place, they don't want just the image returned, they want their watermark. This is proprietary data that they want to be able to have that impact on. So anytime that a map image is exported through REST, that export request is received from the client, whether that's online print service, maybe that's a custom print service, maybe it's something totally outside the ArcGIS system. And an SOI, regardless of where that client request came from, will add a watermark to the exported image. The image is sent back to the client, and that watermark will always be there. It's just a way of intercepting all those requests coming in for that custom business logic, whether that be the watermark or something way more intricate than that. There's a lot of potential here. One last part of the Enterprise SDK, Maggie spoke to it a bit, was custom data feeds. So these were introduced with Enterprise 11.1. It came out last April, so almost a year ago. They allow you to unlock data not currently supported in the ArcGIS system. So what happens is that they can be written for any data source. If you as a developer know what you're doing and can read the data source, you can create a custom data provider. And that will then be able to let the data stay in its data source. The custom data provider is going to be associated with ArcGIS server. That means ArcGIS server can fetch that data from the data source. ArcGIS Enterprise can take it, and a feature service that's read-only is created. When I'm talking about any kind of data source, that could be Elastic, that could be Tableau, that could be a GeoJSON feed on a city's website. We have a sample for Yelp, and we've seen a lot of people interested in that, and it's fun to see, but I'm just showing you there's a lot of potential here. And that we're seeing more and more within our user community build this up with examples of what they're doing in their organizations. You can think about it being in 4 steps. You have your developer create that custom data provider that's written in Java there. And that custom data provider is specific to the data source. So you're going to have a different one if it's something on Yelp versus something in Elastic, maybe an S3 bucket. Those would each be unique custom data providers depending on where that data is coming from. It gets registered with ArcGIS server. So ArcGIS server knows what to do with this information. Without that context, ArcGIS server wouldn't know what to do with this input. That feature service is created. It's a read-only feature service. And it's ready to be consumed in any client. And the beauty of these is that end users don't need to know that it's a feature service from a custom data feed versus SQL Server versus anything perhaps in the ArcGIS data store. This feature service will act just like any other feature service available in Enterprise, consistent for whatever the client may be, whether that is Map Viewer or any of the other applications you want to build upon there. Getting under the hood a little bit, you can think about how the data flows. It's a little bit small, but this flow of data is going from left to right. It's not bidirectional. So the data source will send that raw data. The custom data provider will be able to translate that into GeoJSON. And that's the part where the developer aspect of this comes in. That feature service will then be able to convert that GeoJSON to JSON. This is all ArcGIS Server. You don't need to do this, but it's just to understand how it's actually happening under the hood here. And then that app, that client, is going to display the JSON for that data, for that read-only feature service. And as data is updated in that source data, it will then be reflected in the feature service. Now, of course, keep in mind network latency. If you have your data set halfway across the globe, it's not going to be instantaneous. But also, if you have it on the same machine, you can be able to do some testing in your network and keep that in mind. If this is something that you're interested in implementing in your organization, there's a Node.js runtime that is part of the ArcGIS Enterprise SDK. It needs to be on the development machine there. You also need to have a server machine to avoid resource contention, and that there's a new custom data feed runtime in 11.1 and later that then is actually the runtime powering these feature services. So it's not an Arc objects-based runtime, it's actually something very specific to custom data feeds. And that being said, though, the feature services themselves are identical. Shifting gears a bit, getting out of the ArcGIS Enterprise SDK realm, I do want to talk about webhooks for a moment, because there are webhooks that are specific to ArcGIS Enterprise that I want to make sure you're aware of if this is something that you want to extend your organization further. Before getting into the specifics of ArcGIS Enterprise, though, we can provide a little bit of an overview about what webhooks are. So you have an event occur. This could be whether a new service is published, a user's been added to your ArcGIS Enterprise organization, something's deleted. A webhook will be triggered. So what that means is that there's JSON that contains a description of the event. What's the name of the new person who was added to the organization? What's the name of the group that got changed? There's relevant information here, so it can do something with it. A platform of choice, so not part of the ArcGIS system though, can kick in. That can be Microsoft Power Automate, if this then that, make. There's a lot of options here to think about how you want your webhooks to operate. And what happens is that an action happens. That could be an email, that could be a Teams notification. Maybe you want Alexa to announce it to you. I don't know, you do your thing. But there's a lot of potential here. It's a way of being proactive instead of reactive as an administrator. Event A happens, B happens as well to follow in place so that you know about something in real time, and maybe it's just an informed decision, maybe it's something that you need to take action on, but webhooks make your life that much easier because you're finding out as soon as it happens and not when somebody brings it to your attention. So one of our types of webhooks we have is called organization webhooks. These are specific to ArcGIS Enterprise. They're not in ArcGIS Online right now. That is when you can have them for groups, items, users. So that can be when there are changes to a group in ArcGIS Enterprise. Maybe when somebody has been added to the group, you could get a Slack notification. Maybe when item details are changed. Maybe you want to know if an item has been shared with the entire organization or another group. Maybe you can get an email for that. If a user's deleted, and maybe you don't want them deleted, maybe you want to confirm they're deleted, you could get a text message. There's really a lot of potential here, and hearing use cases from all of you is really what helps us evolve this further to make sure that we're making something here that suits your needs as well. With 11.1, the same release that we introduced custom data feeds, we also introduced service webhooks. So these are webhooks specific for feature services and geoprocessing services. They can be on feature services when something like a create, read, update, or delete event takes place, so a CRUD event. And that can be for both ArcGIS managed or hosted feature layers, or user managed or reference feature layers, coming from a registered data store like SQL Server, Postgres, Oracle, anything like that. All the returns are actually tracked through an API URL, so as much as you've probably tried to want to get away from the REST APIs, they are critical to these workflows here. There's also webhooks for geoprocessing services, for asynchronous services on a job done. That could be with success, it could have failed perhaps, it could have been canceled. Regardless, it just gives you that much more information about the types of services and the events that are happening in your organization to decide if maybe the geoprocessing service needs to be kicked off again. Maybe it needs to be rerun. Maybe you need to make some edits to your Python script and reshare that service. But as an administrator, it's just that much more insight into what is going on within your organization. So that is the enterprise side of extending, but I'm gonna pass it back to Maggie to tell us a bit about the client SDKs and APIs now.
All right, thank you, Jill. Is my mic back on? Yes, okay, thank you. All right, yeah, so closing out the session here, we're going to talk through client SDKs and APIs as a means to create your own custom applications that are taking advantage of content and capabilities that are coming from ArcGIS Enterprise. We got to see a lot of cool demos earlier today in the plenary, so let's take a look at this a little bit. We have a whole wealth of SDKs and APIs that are available to you as an ArcGIS Enterprise user. Jill walked us through the REST API, of course, but as she's mentioned, we want to be selective about when we're actually using it. There's particular workflows when it makes sense, but really as developers, especially if you're building your own web applications or native applications, you're not going to be interacting with that REST API too much. In addition to our Esri provided SDKs and APIs, we know you also want to take advantage of open source technology. Of course, we heard that earlier today, and so we want to make that possible for you. And we have a variety of plugins to kind of meet you where you're doing your work with those open source technologies, whether you're using Leaflet, OpenLayers, Mapbox.gl. We have those plugins and options for you if you're taking advantage of that third-party and open source technology. And then, of course, we have our Esri-provided SDKs and APIs. We have our premier SDK of the ArcGIS Maps SDK, both for JavaScript and native applications. And then we have our ArcGIS API for Python. So let's take a look at these a little bit. First up, we have our ArcGIS Maps SDK for JavaScript, and this is really our premier SDK for building your own custom web applications. It allows you to create these beautiful and interactive user experiences, taking advantage of both 2D and 3D visualizations, as we were seeing earlier today, powered by content and capabilities coming from ArcGIS Enterprise, but also ArcGIS Online or location services coming from ArcGIS platform. And I think the really cool thing about the Maps SDK for JavaScript is it's what's actually used to create our own applications within the ArcGIS system. So maybe you're seeing things in Map Viewer that look really cool, dashboards, story maps, whatever it might be. You want to emulate some of that functionality within your own custom applications. You can take advantage of the Maps SDK for JavaScript to do so, not really recreating the wheel. You want to take advantage of this that you already have available to you. So you're seeing cool things within our own Esri applications that you want to emulate. Please come talk to us at the showcase. We can walk you through how you might use the Maps SDK for JavaScript to do so. On our developer website, we have a lot of sample code snippets as well that can kind of walk you through examples of how to configure these things. And then, of course, you might be building native applications as well. So we also offer the ArcGIS Maps SDK for native apps. So you might be building for mobile devices, desktop, whatever it might be. We have a lot of different flavors for this native apps Maps SDK to really meet you, again, where you're doing your work, whether you're working on an application for a device that's using Java, .NET, Qt, what have you. We have lots of options available to you. And the cool thing about the native Maps SDK for native apps is that it can be connected and powered by ArcGIS Enterprise, Online, and Platform, or it can be totally disconnected and only reliant on data that's locally available on the device where the application is running. One thing that we really commonly see is a hybrid approach. So maybe you're offline and disconnected and you're using that local data within the device, but then you're back connected to the internet. You can get access to ArcGIS Enterprise or ArcGIS Online, and then you're taking advantage of capabilities and content coming from there. So again, that hybrid approach is very common. And then shifting gears here, we also have our ArcGIS API for Python. We really see this commonly being used for three core sets of activity. So for our GIS organization administration, so whether you're trying to manage the users and groups for your organization, you're just trying to customize the look and feel of your ArcGIS Enterprise, the ArcGIS API for Python could play a role in that. Maybe you're doing content management, so you're trying to script the publishing of some content. Maybe you're trying to migrate content from one environment to another. The ArcGIS API for Python can really assist with those types of workflows. And then finally, maybe you're doing some spatial analysis or data science work. Maybe you're just doing some data wrangling, or maybe you're all the way to the point of doing some machine learning, and the ArcGIS API for Python can help you there. Now, we of course are in an intro session, and so we are going to have the whole week to dive into these technologies a little bit more, but I know you certainly want to have some resources to take home with you. And so all of these QR codes are quite helpful to dive in deeper to the topics that Jill and I covered today. I'll mention again, on the ArcGIS developers website, we have tons of sample code snippets, and so that's a really great place to get started if you're trying to familiarize yourself with some of this technology. And then please take advantage of the showcase this week as well. We have tons of developers from Esri here today that are building these things and want to talk to you. And we even have some code review sessions this week as well, so if you have something you're trying to work out and figure out, we have folks here that can help you with that too. So with that, we'll have one ask for you, which is to give us feedback on this session. We want to make sure that what we're talking about in our session today and then our sessions this week are relevant to you and or what you want to hear. So if you have a few moments over the next couple of days and can submit feedback through the Esri Events app, we'd really appreciate that. Jill and I are actually involved in scheduling these sessions and everything, so we read all of that feedback and would really love to hear from you. And then I guess one other ask for you too. We encourage you to take advantage of all of these different ways you can post about the conference via socials. Please don't post pictures of our slides today, as I mentioned earlier, but if you want to just talk about fun that you're having or other things, please feel free to post and use that hashtag that we have available here. So with that, I think we actually have lots of time for questions. So we have somebody from our team, Justin, here. He's going to run the microphone around for us. We'll let everybody raise their hands here and then also take questions up front later on if you'd like. Thank you so much for your time today. Great. All right, I think we have one question back here. Thank you, Justin.
Hi, thanks. You made a comment there about using the JavaScript API directly to use it sparingly. Can you elaborate on why you made that comment?
Yeah, sorry. I'll go back to that slide here so we can dig into it a little bit further. I was actually referring to using the REST API sparingly. I think, as Jill noted, they are really helpful to kind of understand the context of enterprise and the different parts of enterprise that you're interacting with different workflows. They're helpful for particular administrative workflows. But when you're actually building your own custom applications and web applications, the REST API isn't necessarily your best option, but instead you might want to take advantage of the Maps SDK.
Exactly. It's the idea of keeping it simple. If you have an application through the Esri system that already takes care of what you're trying to do, maybe use Map Viewer instead of building a custom mapping application. That's really what we're trying to get at there, is just understanding those fundamental underpinnings, as we call them, and that you don't need to use it sparingly because it's bad to use, but just to be aware that you're using it because that's the best option for you, not one of the out-of-the-box options that's already there for you.
Excellent. Thanks. Other questions?
I know with ArcMap and catalog going away that the functionality of starting and stopping REST services hasn't been added to ArcGIS Pro. Is there anything in the APIs or what have you that we can access that to manage the services themselves? And
so that was a question about how you were able to start and stop services from ArcMap historically and ArcCatalog specifically. And with that in mind, I mean, of course, you can start and stop services through the from the admin API for ArcGIS Server, but we know that's not usually an interface you're interacting in. So what we did in ArcGIS Enterprise 11.2 is we introduced the ability to start and stop services directly in the enterprise portal. So there's that for you, and then also there's more REST calls to make that happen as well. So that's one way of doing that. And then also, I just want to point out that the bit of feedback that is being missed is something we hear, and I'm keeping an eye on my side as well.
Great. We have another question up here. Thank you, Justin. Yeah. Having lots of steps in today.
You mentioned that the webhooks currently supported only on the hosted services. So is there support for it in the roadmap on non-hosted services?
So webhooks are available for hosted services and reference services. It's available for both right now. So regardless of if your feature layer is a hosted feature layer or a reference feature layer, you'll have those options available to you.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
Other questions?
And then we-
Yeah, you mentioned that SOEs and SOIs aren't really available on ArcGIS Enterprise and Kubernetes. Is there a roadmap to bring parity to Windows and Linux?
There is a roadmap for it, and we also have a roadmap session on Thursday here of this conference, which is the last session before the party. So you'll get a little more information there. But yes, it's definitely on the roadmap.
For the webhooks, whenever a job fails, I think it was the geoprocessing webhook, is that just in 11.1 or is that in older versions too?
It's only in 11.1 that we introduced that, and then, of course, anything later than that as well. Okay. Well, I realize there's, one last one.
On the SOIs,
Yeah.
can this be wired to any REST operation, or is it just gets, or can you do wired to posts and puts and deletes?
It can be wired to posts as well.
Okay.
Yes. So gets, posts, everything like that. Any kind of request that's coming into the service, yes. What I had mentioned during the session is more specific, and we have another session here that's specific about SOEs and SOIs. Our product engineers doing that, but also find me afterwards and we can dig into that a bit more. But yeah, it's not just, it's posts and gets.
And now with .NET Core also, or do you think you'll be adding .NET capability to the Linux server in the future, or?
At this point, no, but if that's something you're interested in, I'd like to hear about it too.
Okay,
Yeah, definitely.
all right, thanks.
Okay.
We will be up here as well if you want to come chat with us, if we don't have any other questions.
Just
From
want to
the
thank you
room.
guys for coming to
Yes.
this. Hopefully, this was a good first session of your conference. You guys have a few more days ahead of you. Really hope you enjoy it. And then Maggie and I are going to be here for a few more days yet. So if you see us at the showcase or any of our other sessions, you can still ask us about this content as well. So thank you all again.
Thank you.